It's been a crazy week, and I noticed during this time, I was just talking to a few different people, and um, so my confession to you as just pastor this morning is that it's like the Lord is making me live the things out that I'm preaching to you. Imagine that He would want me to not preach to you as a hypocrite. And so I think the amazing thing about how the texts have lined up, and I don't know if it's just providence or it's just me in the season of life that I'm in, but it feels like every week the thing that I'm dealing with and the thing that I'm going through is exactly the text for today. And so we picked that up again this week, and we'll be in Hebrews chapter 11. And if you'll just give your attention to the scripture this morning, and if you have your Bible, if you'll open that up or your device, and we're going to be in verses 22 and 23, picking up the very end of Joseph's story and the beginning of Moses's. Verse 22 says, "By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, he made mention of the exodus of the Israelites, and he gave directions concerning his bones. And then by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." Would you guys pray with me before we just open the rest of the word this morning? Our Father and God, we've come to you now in singing your praise and declaring truths about you, and perhaps this morning those things feel distant to us, or they're right things to say, but maybe not things that we really believe or that we feel. Father, I ask that you would use your word this morning as the tool and the mechanism that only you can use and wield by your Spirit, the scalpel that we need to cut out hard places in our heart and our life and our faith, so that we could grow more and more to look like your Son, and that you would receive glory for this. God, I just ask that you would keep me from error. Give me strength to preach what only you would have this morning. Father, equip us with what we need to have this time be a fruitful word. So, Father, open our eyes and our ears. Give us hearts that are spiritual so that we can receive the word that's planted in them this morning. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. If you'll give me just one moment, and I just need to make sure that my slides are working so that we can follow along this morning. If not, would you just put up that first slide for me? This is the Hope Diamond. You may have heard of this before. It's not the largest diamond in the world, but it's notable for its carat size for sure, and its unique color. And you maybe have seen this or heard of it, and it's an impressive jewel in its own right. And so it's called the Hope Diamond. You guys know this? Am I giving you new information right now? It's possible, and that's okay because some of you went to public school and so did I. But what is the name of the diamond that's just next to the Hope Diamond? Nobody knows. How about any of the diamonds later down in the chain? No one knows. I think this is sort of a genuine illustration for how things get sort of out of touch and out of place for us. Christ is the diamond of history. The gospel in the redeeming story is all about what God is doing in this jewel of Christ. And we might get to be a part of that story in a genuine way with genuine value. They're looking at any of the diamonds that are attached to the Hope Diamond and being like, those things don't have value. And yet, you don't know their names. They're nondescript in some sense, but they're notable for the fact that they are part of the sequence of jewelry that holds the Hope Diamond in place. Are you tracking with this story? And the problem with our approach to life and our approach to faith is we think we only matter when we're the diamond in the center. We want to be the pendant, and God's not telling a story necessarily about you. He's telling a story in Christ. And we belong to this story in a genuine way, but in an equally nondescript way. In a valuable way, but in equally not the point kind of way. And I think this is hard for us to grasp onto. If you were to walk up to any sort of running body of water, a river, a stream of some sort, you would not assume that it began right at the very place where you walked up to it, and you would not assume that the end of it is right at the place that you stand. It clearly has an upstream and a downstream. It's going somewhere, it's doing something. And we're meant to use our faith and our eyes of faith and our heart of faith to be humbly coming to the stream of redemption. It's all about the featured jewel of Christ and finding our humble place along this stream and understanding that there was things that happened upstream of us and there are things that will happen downstream of us. And we're integral to this story. It's not that you're incidental. Like everybody's included in this story. But we are meant to bring a humble heart and a humble mind and a humble thought to what we're doing as we participate in it. And so the question of value and purpose is not in your prominence or position. It's not you jockeying to get to the middle of the necklace. It's accepting the place that God has actually providentially placed you in life so that you can faithfully participate in the story that he's telling. And someday you will be able to look back and see everything that God has been doing. But listen, I'm going to give you all of the bad news up front. I mentioned that sort of kind of the things that like we're going through in life are sort of speaking to what I've been studying and kind of where we're at in the text. And so I got to listen to the commencement speeches yesterday at Eva's graduation. And I was thinking, oh, that's right. Oh, that's truth. And oh, that's good. And then at the same time, as these truths are unrolling and they're trying to encourage these students to step out into the world, it's mixed with sort of a worldly approach to things that actually is trying to teach you something that if you don't see the results of your work, that your value can't be known. Let me say that a different way, because this is where it attaches to the scripture and where it attaches to the story of Joseph. So we looked at the story of Joseph last week and all of the things that he goes through and all of his trials. And in the moment, none of it makes sense. And then we kind of see this thing where we get to the triumph or the resolution on all those trials. And then he kind of looks back and you think he's saying, oh, I see the purpose in everything that I've gone through. Here it is at the moment of termination. I've come to the top of the mountain and now everything makes sense. And he doesn't say that. You might think that he's saying that. You might believe that he's saying that, but he hasn't said that. What he says is this. All the things that I've gone through, you may have meant these things for evil, but God meant them for good. And then he doesn't say, so that I would be here in this position. Like he doesn't make that the summit. Like what Joseph understands and what you need to understand is that you may never see in this life the resolution of anything that you have invested in. You can't expect that. If you do, you're setting yourself up for disappointment and failure. And your value can't be found in that. Because we kind of connect that. Oh, the greater the suffering, the greater the trial, the greater the investment, the greater the reward. And we want it to be on this side of heaven. And that's a setup for failure. I kind of heard and I saw and I cringed a little bit, but I think there's an element of, yes, you need to pursue. Yes, you need to seek doing great things, but not for the purpose of finding your value in those, because you may never get that affirmation now. So what will you do if you don't get it? Will you despair? Will you give up? Would you say it wasn't worth it? Emphatically, no. Joseph's story tells you that it is worth it. But he also sees that the story was not about him. It's going to continue on down the line. And he pushes the story down the line. He says, take your focus off of me and look down the line. I called this sort of a little topic statement or a thesis for the morning is the elusive search for a so that moment in your life. You want to look for that moment that you can say, oh, I see that, so that. Now I understand. It makes sense now, and I see because the benefit came here. Now I see why God has done this thing. And that's not what we're meant to search for. That's not what we're meant to live on. That's not what we're meant to pursue. Because we all too often become then a fair-weathered kind of gospel person. We are a so that dependent people of faith. If you or I were telling Joseph's story, or maybe your story is something like Joseph's story, your testimony legitimately could be, God has brought me through so much. And then you stand in a moment, somehow in reflection, and you go, I don't understand why it went that way, but in some sense, I see it couldn't have gone any other way. And that's an absolute truth. It's absolutely true that you are here only by God's providence and his meticulous sovereignty over every circumstance of your life. But listen, that's not the point. So your testimony is a genuine aspect of this. So this probably feels counterintuitive to you, but the best thing I can do for you to help you have a genuine faith, that you would form around God rather than yourself. And it sounds like you're doing that. It feels like you're doing that because it feels like in certain places it aligns with Scripture. It seems like that's kind of what's happening. And in certain places it can work. But emphatically, it's always pushing forward. There's always a greater point. There's always something bigger happening. So the valuation request is what I've done, what I've gone through, what it produced. Is it worth it? Has to be answered in something greater than yourself. Because the alternative is this. And this is what countless people are pursuing in the world and inside the church. In fact, it's problematic that there's not actually that much of a distinction. That you're still trying to create a value for yourself by realizing it in yourself. That's what the world is out there trying to do. They want to seek and pursue. They want to build a little sandcastle of meaning. Here's what my life is worth. Here's what I've done. Look at all I've accomplished. And they stand on the top of their little sandcastle at the end of their life, and it's actually meaningless in the breadth of all of history. That's not a vista. That's not a view that you get on the front end. It's just disappointment and ash at the end. That's not where we're meant to really genuinely find our value. See, the greatest value you could actually find, the biggest thing that you could actually embrace is not the most that you can make of your life, but it is in the story that God is already telling about the most valuable thing there is. And you get to find your value in that. You will not spend eternity talking about the things that you accomplished. I mean, somehow, some way, even in the minor details and everything that you've done, your faithfulness is actually telling the story of Christ. And somehow all of that gets worked out so that in eternity, what we're talking about is I can't believe that one thing that I didn't know was going to mean anything actually resulted in something downstream amazing. This is Joseph. So here we find Joseph's last words. And that's where we'll pick it up in verse 22 this morning. Would you put that up for me? Thank you. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, this is like his dying breath. He makes mention of the exodus of the Israelites, and he gave directions concerning his bones. This is faith. This is Joseph's faith on display. This is Joseph's true commentary on what the purpose of his life is. And he doesn't make it about getting people to Egypt or the palace or the place that he holds or preserving any of these Egyptians or the Israelites' lives through famine. None of that is the case. He sees that as a purpose along the way. It's a stepping stone, a necessary bridge in the greater story that God is telling. Let me just back up for a second to get the grand context of Hebrews 11, right? What is happening in this chapter? Is he just highlighting all of the people that have done better than us? Absolutely not. He's tracing God's sovereign, almost invisible hand through the lives of people who've acted on faith and how God has preserved his promises in spite of and counterintuitively to all of our logic about how that's going to happen. And Joseph is just one more testimony. Why is he in Egypt? Well, because God needs to bring them through Egypt. This isn't just a byway. It's not an accident of fate. This is God's determined plan to bring them through on the way to something greater. So Joseph's last words are a prophetic reminder. It's a forward-looking memory. What is he remembering, we're told? Well, when he says here at the end of his life, he makes mention of the Exodus. He's talking about something that's not yet happened, but he knows it will happen because of a prophecy that his great-grandfather Abraham was given. When Abraham was promised that the land would be his, that the people would come into possession of it. As a nation, he's also told there's going to be 400 years where your people will be in a land not their own. And along with this promise is a term. For 400 years, for generations, they're going to be there. And he says, so that, and there's a so that attached to it. And I'm not going to give you that release just yet, but just keep it in your back pocket. So Joseph remembers this prophecy. And this is what he speaks to the Israelites as a promise. Here's what's going to happen. I want you guys to know this. Looking forward, I'm remembering what God will do because he said he will do it. So Joseph here is demonstrating again that faith binds hope to future promises. That's what Hebrews 11:1 tells us. That faith is the substance of things hoped for, right? The things not seen. It's the evidence that we grasp onto. It's the substance that we walk forward in. And here Joseph is doing that. So he's binding the hope of a people to a promised future. And listen, a promise that is so guaranteed, it's so possessed, it's like so held in his mind and in his heart and in his will that it endures as life itself. That sounds poetic, but it's important that you understand that. Joseph's dying words reveal this stream of faith perspective that I said. He walks up to the stream that's already running. He sees upstream that his great-grandfather Abraham had received a promise, and he looks downstream and he says, God's going to do something, and here's what I'm going to do in this moment to be faithful. So Joseph's dying words reveal this, and he remembers the promise that's given, that the descendants would come out, and then they would possess the land. So there is a promised land that's going to come, but it's going to come in some distant time. We have literally 10 generations of, if you count 40 years as a generation, 10 generations of Israelites living and dying, waiting for a promise for something that God had already said he would do. There's three things that are happening that we see in this statement that Joseph makes. First is this: Egypt isn't permanent. It's not the place they were going to end up. Joseph knows this regardless of the great position that he has, the prominent status that he has, all of the good that he's doing in Egypt. None of that is actually permanent. But it's also not an accident. It's not incidental. Part of Joseph's so that statement is that so that many people would be kept alive as they are today. And he includes both Israelites, his family, and the Egyptians. God had preserved them through a famine. But Egypt isn't permanent. It's a temporary destination along the way. This gives a greater picture to what was first opened up with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs that live in a land of promise in tents, knowing that this is not their permanent structure, permanent home. You too are supposed to embrace this mentality. This is home, but it's not fully home yet. Canaan, though, is the next stop. The promised land is going to be next. It is going to come. So just as God fulfilled the word to Joseph about his brothers coming to bow down to him and serving him, God would also fulfill this word that he had spoken to his fathers about possessing this land. Joseph sees that not as a possession for 400 years down the road. It's his possession now. He sees that. He embraces that. That's what's moving his hope forward. That's what his faith is in this moment. And we know that because what he instructs the Israelites to do, he makes them swear an oath not to leave his bones in Egypt. And this is the third thing, which also has its own three implications. Are you ready? He instructs the Israelites not to leave his bones in Egypt. Joseph is binding his hopes in death to a future that it's promised. So his testimony in death is important as what he did in life. And he doesn't even point to what he did in life as the purpose of his life. He's actually looking at this greater promise that he has. And he asked the sons of Israel to carry his bones out of Egypt. And this gives us three important things. The first is this: he understands that this is not a promise he will see in this life. He's not looking for the promised land in this life. He understands death stands between him and the promise that he's set his hope in. Right? It's not going to be seen here, but then he has a resolution on that, and he says, but I will see it. But he doesn't say, I'm going to see it in my soul. I'm going to see it as a disembodied spirit. I'm going to see it in my memory being there. He believes he will see it in his body and behold it with his own flesh and blood eyes. And not just by himself, but with the people he's instructing to take his bones with him. So it's not here, it's not this lifetime, but I will see it. I will see it in my body, and I'm going to see it with all of you, other recipients of the promise. And so that's why he instructs them to carry his bones out of Egypt. Don't leave me here, because he will not rest in death in anything other than the promise that God had given. This isn't, guys, don't forget about me. It's not, just remember how much I did for all of you. This is the same hope and the same resurrection logic that Abraham displays on the mountain with Isaac. He doesn't necessarily understand how God's going to do it, but the only answer, if it's on the other side of death, it must be that God will honor this promise in life. So that's the only conclusion he can hope in. This is an absolute promise. It was given to me. I'm not going to see it in this life, but I must be able to see it. And the only answer has to be resurrection. The care for the body, like in ancient times and now today, what you do when you die says something about where you plan to be. The Egyptians, right, they made a big deal about preparing the body, preserving the body. Sometimes they'd even kill your wives and your servants, and they would be buried with you so that they could journey with you to the land of the dead in the afterlife. They were preparing the body for what they thought was next. Joseph, as a direct antithesis for that, is like, don't let my bones get dusty. I need those still. He plans to use them again. There's hope in his death that he's going to need those very same bones, and he wants to make sure they're in the place that he's promised when he uses them again. This is a direct contrast to how most people think about death. Well, death is the end. Death is goodbye. For Joseph, it's like, I'll see you later. That should be our mentality. Death is merely this breath between now and eternal life, and there may be some substantive gap between when we are enfleshed again, but it is the next moment that will come. So Joseph leaves the people with an oath and a promise that they must swear. He reminds them what's going to happen. He says, this is our possession. Here's what you need to do. Swear to me. And then he says, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. He doesn't just make them swear an oath, but he also attaches their oath to an expectation. What is it? God will visit you. He's coming. The next thing on the timeline, the thing that you ought to look for, what you ought to hope in, what you ought to be expecting and looking for, is God will visit you. So Egypt now is clearly just a temporary dwelling. But listen, it's a temporary dwelling for 400 years, an extensive period of time, which introduces us now to verse 23. A hope hanging out there, a promise. And then it says, by faith, Moses. Now, when we think about Moses, we have lots of pictures of Moses, probably the most prominent figure in Old Testament. And Joseph, probably second most prominent figure in the Old Testament. Like, we kind of know their stories. We're loosely aware of everything that has happened because of all that Moses does. But the first thing that the author of Hebrews wants to point you to in the story of Moses is not anything that Moses did. He wants to talk about what the people before Moses did. And so he points to Moses' parents. Guess what? Moses had zero to do with this example of faith. He was the recipient, he was the benefit, he was the downstream beneficiary of the faithfulness of a generation of people who were not acting on anything other than faith. I just want to set out that context. So by faith, Moses, when he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Do you guys know Moses' parents' names? Not unless you're a super quizzer or a history buff. Amram and Jochebed. They are recorded for us, but you've forgotten their names, just like you don't know the names of the diamonds that are surrounding the Hope Diamond. And yet, without them, Moses in all of his glory and everything that he accomplishes don't exist because there's a death threat on the people of Israel. The gap between Genesis to Exodus, you turn one page and it's been 400 years and the people have multiplied into a nation of millions of people. So much so that the Egyptians begin to fear that they'll be overtaken by this robust people. And so Pharaoh issues an edict. We gotta do something to kind of cull the herd. We gotta make sure that these people don't overtake us. And so the first command he gives is for the midwives to kill the babies of all of the Israelite people. They defy this order. And so this kind of moves to a greater thing. And the Pharaoh is so incensed that he actually increases his anger. He increases kind of the cruelty. And he actually opens it to all of Egypt. And he says, if any of you see a Hebrew boy, you throw him in the river. And so that presents this context, the circumstances in which Amram and Jochebed are faced with a question of faithfulness. The most allegedly powerful man in the whole world at this moment, who has complete control over their lives, presents them with a choice. What will you do when we command to kill your children? There's this little nugget that we're given here. But they don't fear the king's edict, not because they're rebels at heart and they just want to see what they can get away with. It's just because they see the child was beautiful. And you might think, well, of course, every mom thinks their child is beautiful. And so why is this special? And you have missed sort of the nuance of this word. It's only used twice in all of the New Testament. And it's always used in reference to Moses. It's here, and then also in Acts 7, as Stephen is giving his speech, and he's kind of recounting the history of Israel and all that's happened. And he talks about, again, these parents, how they perceived the beauty of Moses. And the idea here is this. It's tough to communicate, but it's something like this. His beauty before God. That God actually perceives the value of Moses. But Amram and Jochebed, they don't know anything about God's plans for Moses. There's no dream and there's no vision that says, your son is the Redeemer. If you don't do this, nothing can be done without your help. Like, there's no kind of real concrete promise that if they do this, something better is coming. But they do it anyway. Why? Because they perceive that God could do something with only their just naked faithfulness to God. And understanding the value of what they have in a life. He's beautiful before God, Moses is. There's no tattoo on his forehead. He doesn't come out glowing as he will later as he meets face to face with the Redeemer. It's just Moses as a baby with all of the inherent value instilled in a baby. And I would be remiss if we didn't just talk about the problem of valuation of life here and how it's totally inverted. And the mindset of the world is this: if your existence costs me something, you're expendable, which is why abortion works. And why people choose abortion rather than life. Well, you're going to get in the way of my values and my dreams. And so you are less than me because you are smaller than me, or you're defenseless. And so I estimate my value as greater than your value. And so we see this as a satanic mechanism over and over. It wasn't new when they legalized abortion in America. It's been around because the war of the seed of Satan has always been against the war of God's image in humanity and the seed of the promise. And this is the form it always takes. And it's so easy because babies are defenseless. They rely on the help of somebody else. And so listen, I just need to tell you that there's no value that's anything other than completely equitable before God. He doesn't see a Hebrew baby. Moses is not more valuable than any other Hebrew baby that was killed. Moses is not better than any of the Egyptian babies that didn't have any threat against their life. God sees them all as equal, and we are to value them in the same way. Why? Because they bear God's image. Their faithfulness is not celebrated immediately. Everything about what they did for 3 months is just, we're going to take circumstances into our hands. We're going to trust that God can do something with this bit of faithfulness, and he does. But it's not promised on the front end. There's no saying that they don't also forfeit their lives because they preserve Moses' life. Like, I don't know all of the context, but they're also not the only ones that do this. So amongst other people that are preserving the lives of their Hebrew babies, Moses stands out because of the faithfulness of their parents. Faithfulness isn't easy. It's not always celebrated. We're not alone, though. And that's sort of the lie that we can buy into. Or that the cost for faithfulness is greater than what it's worth paying. In that psalm that we read during the worship this morning, Psalm 84, how lovely is your dwelling place. Lord, I want to be where you are. But the key verse I actually want you to notice is verse 10 in Psalm 84 in verse 10. Would you put that up? A day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. And then he says, the psalmist, I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. I just want you to see a valuation comparison. If you could spend the rest of your life in vast luxury, being important, and people serving you, that's what that word dwell means. It means like to kind of like mount up this heap and sit on top of it and dwell in luxury. He says, if that was my choice, or I could just be an unknown person and hold the door open near the house of God, I'd choose to be a doorkeeper. I'd rather be nothing and unknown than be near to God. I'd rather be near his house and his faithfulness than to be known and celebrated. Just a few verses prior to this, he says, even the sparrow finds a home near your altar. Jesus picks up that same image of a sparrow later. He's like, do you know that the sparrows, God takes care of them? Not even a sparrow that you don't pay any mind to. You've done nothing to feed it. God knows when it falls. That's the value of a God who knows everything and who's sovereign over everything. Even a sparrow, this little bird, can dwell near the house of God because God finds value in everything. He determines the value of everything. So listen, the faithfulness is an important aspect because your value is not in what you accomplish. It's assigned to you by the God who made you. God doesn't pay attention to the sparrow because it's the greatest bird or it serves his purposes in some way other than just being alive. So your measurement and your actions of your faithfulness can't be measured against what kind of value you create by doing them. So it says for us that Moses' parents, without any guarantees, they hide Moses for 3 months. And sort of this interesting, ironic twist, that the command that Pharaoh had given for any Egyptians to throw the Hebrew babies into the river, it actually ends up being the vehicle of deliverance for Moses. They create a little basket for him, a basket of reeds. It's kind of an ark, they say. And he's put in the river and he's sent upstream, and then he finds Pharaoh's daughter. And that's where he's kept safe. The very household that Joseph kind of rose to second in command to now becomes sort of the object of opposition. The Pharaoh now is commanding the death where Joseph had preserved Pharaoh's life. Pharaoh wouldn't exist without Joseph. But it says they've long forgotten what Joseph had done. And so now we have this next bit of the story that's set up by God. What will God do? How will he honor this promise? The people are now in slavery. There's a very threat of death against their lives. Here's a few applications for us in closing. There's a gap that exists. I told you it's a gap between, you turn the page from Genesis to Exodus, and there's 400 years with a promise just existing out there. Not a single person is named in this 400-year gap, except for Moses' parents. We find out later what their names are. So for 400 years, the testimony is a people that are waiting with Joseph's bones on a promise for God to visit us. And how God is going to visit them is unknown. It's just a promise. I'm going to visit you, God says. And so for 10 generations of Israelites, the family of 70 grows to millions, and including Moses' parents, they live in this promise. God will visit us. He will bring us to a place of promise. He's guaranteed it. This is what's going to happen. We have this life lived in the gap of a promise. And it's possessed by all who believe in the promise. Remember, I said I come back to this. There's an until moment. It's not open-ended. When God tells Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, but for 400 years, your people are going to be enslaved in a land that's not theirs. And then he says, because. He actually gives a reason why. Because I'm doing something else with a people that you know nothing about, the Amorites. They're the ones that actually possess the promised land right now. But he says their iniquity is not complete. But once it is, in 400 years, I'm bringing you out. Now, all the details of that are unknown. But I just want you to see a comparison here. You have a people of promise who are enslaved and a people who know nothing really about the promise, but they're also serving God's purposes. It doesn't matter if you acknowledge it or not. You are serving God's purposes. Whether you're sitting to fill up iniquity and God's judgment is going to happen through his people, you're serving God's purposes. And so we have this people that are meant to live in faith on this promise. There's another interesting thing that happens. At the end of the Old Testament, the last prophet that we find in the Old Testament, Malachi, his promise is that the Lord's going to come and he's going to visit you. He's going to come into his temple. And it's not a coincidence that there's a 400-year silence between the last prophet of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament and the arrival of John the Baptist, who's proclaiming, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Prepare the way, the deliverer is coming. Let me just fast forward one more to you, because that promise is honored as well. God never leaves us wondering about which promise to hope in or how faithfulness should look in the midst of his absence, because you are in a gap right now. It's just that this gap is the one that doesn't have an end point on it. He doesn't tell us how long the gap is going to be, but he does tell us there will be an end of the gap. There's going to be an end of the time that I am going to return to you. I will come to you again. That's the promise that Jesus leaves all of his people with. I'm going to come. I'm going to return. When he's ascended to heaven, the angels say he's going to return just in the way that you saw him leave. So go, get to work. That was the last thing Christ gave the apostles to do. Wait for the power and then go on mission. And so you live in this gap right now. I will come to you again. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. I will give you power. Now go and witness. And Paul tells us in Romans that the end point of this gap, just like the Amorites had to fill up their iniquity, he says, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Guess what? You're the Gentiles. Until God's done bringing people to himself to trust in his promise. So when you say, well, how long? How long will he wait? When's he coming back? Nobody knows the day or the hour, but the day or the hour looks like this. Once God's redeemed everybody he's going to redeem, he's going to return. And it says with the cry of an angel and the trumpet sounding, he's going to come and he's going to return to us. And then Paul says, those that are alive are going to be gathered together with him. But he says everybody that's dead is going to be risen out of their graves, both the just and the unjust. Everybody's going to be in their bones again. And he's going to separate faithful from unfaithful. That's what's holding. But he says, look, between now and then, if I put a giant clock in the sky and it was counting down, that wouldn't be faithfulness. Because there's two ways you fall off there. One is to say, look how much time we have, what's the point? The other is to say, there's not much time left, we better get to work. He leaves you with a promise that it will work, so get to work. I'm going to bring people to myself. I'm going to give you power in the gospel. And so we live in this gap right now on the promise that everything that you have cannot be realized in this life. Just like Joseph understood the promise. That there's a promised land coming. That land is the very earth that you stand on right now, but redeemed and righteous. All iniquity gone, all curse removed. All causes of sin removed. And he says, when we see him, when he comes, we shall be like him, because we'll see him face to face, and we'll be in redeemed bodies, and everything's changed in the twinkling of an eye. You can't realize that here and now, and you can't know what any action you take along the way will result in. This is why I started with evaluation. If the greatest meaning of your story is what you can complete, what you will do, the results that you'll see, you're so that moment, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're going to be disappointed. You're going to despair. You're going to not understand anything because God's not promised you that. You're great, so that moment is when you see your Redeemer face to face. In all of you, if you are in faith right now, you sit here because somebody before you, nameless and faceless, gave or served or shared. You don't know their name. You don't know what tithe check they gave. You don't have any idea what caused your very spot in the redemption river that's been running since Christ left, or even from the beginning of time, right? You can't know what your faithfulness will do downstream of you, and so that's why we're called just to work faithfully, because the final day is set, and we don't know when it is. So Jesus says, so be faithful servants, because that's what we are. I'm going to leave you with this last word. Paul, who we all want to celebrate, who we would all say, look at everything that he accomplishes. He goes, what's Paul? And what is Apollos? We're just servants. You know, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. God's telling a story. God's doing something, and we're nothing. We're just servants. We're tools in the hands of a God who's telling a greater story. Faith must plant seeds and water seeds and till ground and pull weeds for a harvest that you may not see, but you will surely benefit from in eternity. And it will not be celebrated. You'll see what God has done with simple faithfulness. This is the thread across all time. This is the thread of faith. This is what you're called to, is to believe in this. That even the small things are great in God's hands. He's not called you to be a hero. He doesn't need you to be a hero. And in fact, the more you try to step into that spotlight, the less you're in it. And the more you're building a kingdom that will not matter. It will be a testimony for all those who are crushed beneath the feet of Christ. Would you pray with me? God, I pray that this is a word of hope, a word of encouragement, a word of faith, that we be reminded about this testimony of a God who's telling the greatest story, and we